Hello, everyone. Thank you, Nancy. Welcome to another one of our virtual events. It's great to see all of our members, strategic partners, and guests here today. While I'm making my announcements, I'd love to see a little chatter in the chat box. Please enter what company you're with and or where you're joining us from or anything else you'd like to share. We're excited to host this session with Dan Reilly from SMS Research on the state of the supply chain. I think this will be an interesting and timely session. Before we get started, I want to share just a couple of upcoming events. First and most importantly, I think we are hosting a happy hour plus trivia plus ugly sweater contest immediately following this session. I'll put the link in the chat box as we get near the end of the session. You can simply cut and paste that into a new browser and join that way. Or if you've already registered, you can check your email for the notice there. We are lining up all of our programs for next year. We'll have a newsletter out tomorrow with many more details. Please take a look at that and review the events and other happenings at FEI Twin Cities. One quick note, our first session of the new year is on January 13th, and it's on moving diversity, equity, and inclusion forward, and will feature Tawana Black, founder and CEO of the Minneapolis-St. Paul-based Center for Economic Inclusion. She'll be covering the key indicators of an inclusive economy and what financial executives and board members can do to advance inclusive growth and prosperity for their communities. Our newsletter and more information can be found at feitwincities.com. And with that, we're going to get started. So please feel free during the session to post your questions in the Q&A box. We'll get to as many of those as we can. I now have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dan Reilly, Senior Vice President with SMS Research. Welcome, Dan.
Welcome. Thank you.
Dan, I've just launched our first poll for our audience. We're interested if you're wishing to earn CP credit for today's presentation. I'll give you just a few seconds to answer that. Okay, thank you very much, folks. I'm going to end that poll, and Dan, I'm going to let you take over the screen.
Super. I appreciate it very much. Make sure I got everything up here. Okay, well, I appreciate everyone taking the time today to hear us talk about supply chain in the post-COVID environment. The presentation today is going to cover some really interesting topics related to supply chain itself and the role that supply chain has not only played prior to COVID, but how COVID has changed the way in which supply chain interacts not only with their customers, but with ultimately the end user. So here's what we're going to cover today specifically. We're going to cover really three topics: the economic impact of the pandemic, including the underlying reasons for the severity of the impact. So we're not going to only look at the look at the impact itself, but get some understanding as to why it's been so severe. We're also going to talk about the pandemic has affected the way in which supply chain operates. So we're going to be looking at some different areas in terms of the relationship with other vendors, the relationship with supply chain itself, specifically when we look at lean and agile. And then we're also going to look at how it impacts customers. And then finally, we're going to talk about the future opportunity for supply chain in the post-COVID economy. So as you can see by these headlines here, and these are headlines I grabbed literally 2 days ago, COVID's impacting our economy in ways we never imagined. And it's not just folks who have full-time jobs. It's young Americans who are feeling an economic toll. 128,000 people in IT lost their jobs because of COVID ID. That's something that prior to COVID was almost unheard of. That many people losing their jobs in IT. So you could see that it's been not only in our individual perspectives, but also all across the country. And I wanted to show you guys this slide because this slide really dictates a couple of things that are important. The first thing is the slide itself just shows world GDP, and it goes all the way back to 1995. And what it does is it highlights four significant drops. The first one is the currency crisis in the EU and in Asia as well. And that one is right there. The second one is the dot-com crash in 9/11. The third is the subprime crash. and the global financial crisis, and finally, the COVID-19 shot. There's a couple of things that are interesting about this. This was originally produced in 2019, and you can see this little gray fella right there. That's what the IMF thought was going to happen. Like many of us, they thought this is a short-term thing. We'll get through it and all will be done. But the downside is what actually occurred. And you could see it's a significant drop. What makes this really interesting from anything else we've experienced is these three here all have really one thing in common. It was speculators that drove the market. So it was speculators in currency, speculators in creating the dot-com bubble. And then, of course, subprime mortgages also were speculators. All of those were created by speculators. This is the first drop we've had in 25 years, maybe even going back to the flu pandemic of 1918, so almost 100 years, where we haven't had a significant impact due to speculators. This is something that we don't really have any experience with. And that has become a big problem for how we deal with things, especially on the economic side. And there were several reasons why the economy failed within the context of COVID. Now, in most cases, we see COVID almost every season. It's hurricanes or tornadoes. When we see hurricanes happening, people participate in very familiar behaviors, supply chain reacts in a very familiar way, and we see the long lines of losing things such as water, such as some foodstuffs, certainly toiletries, but that's usually for a few days, and it's usually very localized. If not to a metro area, then certainly just a portion of a state. We have not seen it nationwide and have never seen it worldwide, at least not in 100 years. And so there were several elements that happened, and several of these I think are familiar, and one I think is going to be really interesting to explore. The first one is shortage of finished supplies. The US-China trade war had a significant impact on the ability to react. Temporary trade restrictions from the US to the EU and Asia that had a significant impact just when we needed to have those trade restrictions released to reduce the impact of the economic downturn. Countries did the opposite. Countries closed their borders. Underlying many of that is the rise in economic nationalism. And what we mean by economic nationalism is the sense that it's our economy that matters the most, and that we are able to sever the ties to other nations with our economy and still be okay. As evidence, that's not true. Honestly, it hasn't been really ever true, but certainly in this case, economic nationalism became a significant factor in contributing to the impact of COVID. And finally, we say that changes in buyer performance. And this is the one I want to focus on, because I think this is the one that is not only the most interesting for supply chain, but it's also one of the least understood. So let's go into a little bit deeper in buyer performance. When we think about a buyer, and it doesn't matter what it is, it can be a defense system or it can be a candy bar. There's really three elements at play: motivation, performance, and intent. And motivation is the foundation that inspires action. In other words, if we don't believe that we should do it, if our society that we surround ourselves with, whether it's the government, whether it's friends, whether it's our employer, if they believe we should do it, and if there's nothing in our way saying that we shouldn't do it, then we're going to do that behavior. The best way to understand this is to think about your favorite cake. Now, I just had a birthday, so my favorite cake apparently is yellow frosting, or yellow cake with chocolate frosting. It's actually my daughter's favorite, but apparently it's now mine. So because that's what we had. So I actually like that cake. It's delicious. It reminds me of my daughter. It reminds me of family. So I really like that cake. So you could say that my opinions about that cake are high. Now, let's say I'm eating this cake and my boss walks by and says, "Oh, I love that cake. I remember having that cake as a kid. It's great. You should come by my office after and let's talk about how we can work on this new project I've got going on, because that cake reminded me to talk to you about it." And then let's say once we get that wonderful compliment, another friend walks by and says, "Oh, I love that cake. You know, I'm going to bake a cake this weekend. You should come over to my house. We'll have some wine. We'll have a couple of drinks, and we'll make the cake together. It'll be a lot of fun." Okay, great. Now it's just I'm about to eat this cake. Something pops up on my internet saying that if you eat this cake, it reduces your risk of cancer by 50%, according to the FDA. So that means that those that I associate with, those in my social system, they like the cake. So I like the cake and they like the cake. Now let's say I show you an advertisement that makes you hungry and I put the cake right in front of you. Chances are you're going to eat that cake. Now let's say I take that cake and I put it at the bottom of the ocean. Chances of eating that cake have just gone down significantly. You still want it. Your friends think it's great. Your boss thinks it's great. The government thinks it's great. But it's at the bottom of the ocean. That means that there's a barrier, what we call a controlling effect, that it inhibits your ability to proceed on that action. Now, there's also changes in terms of motivating of yourself and motivation of others that impacts that as well. But it's this idea that all three of them work together to create motivation. Performance is the assessment of the action's success or outcome. Hey, did I enjoy the cake? Did the cake make me feel better? Did we have a good time? That's the performance of it. So we've got, did I want to do this action? And then we've got, how did it feel to complete that action? Well, what we're missing is intent. And that's the cognitive influences that drive action. If supply chain has an area that it impacts in this buyer performance, it's intent. It's not necessarily motivation. It's not necessarily performance. It's intent. Supply chain is the group that provides the intent for the buyer to go from motivation to behavior to performance. And just a quick point to make on this chart, see that little star where it says behavior, action? The fact that the behavior is done itself, as long as you focus on motivation, intent, and performance, if you focus on these three, then the behavior becomes almost irrelevant because you're able to predict the behavior, you're able to predict why the behavior is happening, and you're able to measure the effectiveness of that behavior. So if you know all those three things, the behavior becomes less important. And this is really important to understand because people in supply chain, and quite frankly, in any walk of life, focus on the behavior. If we know the behavior, then we've got everything figured out. And our perspective has always been, if you know motivation, intent, and performance, you don't need to worry about the behavior because you're going to be able to predict that behavior. So here's an example of buyer performance in action. So there were three behavior levels in the areas prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. We looked at three of them: cooking from home, wearing a mask, and working remotely. So prior to COVID, 82% of the US population cooked at least 50% of their meals from home. Wearing a mask, 1% of the population wore a mask in public. Most of these people were either chronically ill, they were immigrants from foreign countries, most predominantly Asia, where wearing a mask has been much more socially acceptable for close to a decade. And then working remotely, 16% of the US spend at least 50% or more of their time working from home. So then COVID hits and behaviors begin to change. How did they change? We'll take a look at cooking at home. In 2019, approximately 82% of the population cooked at home. When the pandemic hit, one of the first things that was hit were restaurants. People literally had no choice. They had to cook at home. This allowed them additional time because they weren't getting ready to go out. They weren't actually going out. They had time at home, plus remotely, plus people no longer being employed. They had the free time. This free time allowed them to participate in what we call a safe adventure. And a safe adventure is something where your risk is minimum, but your reward is significant. Going on a roller coaster is a safe adventure. Your risk is minimal, but your reward, if you like roller coasters, can be significant. Cooking something new is the same way. As a result, 30% of consumers changed the way they cooked during the pandemic. This led them to buy more fruits, vegetables, and beef. So you can see that the pandemic changed the way in which people were motivated about behavior. Take another example for wearing a mask. During the population, approximately 96% of the population is under a civil order to wear a mask. That actually is numbers now closer to 99%. In addition, consumers see the need for wearing a mask. However, when it comes to one's personal desire to wear a mask, things are really different. Almost 1 in 5 people refuse to wear a mask. Fear of government intrusion or inability of individual rights to be a part of the larger perspective are what impacts not being able to wear a mask. And then finally, working remotely. We saw roughly 1/2 of the workforce right now is working from home on a regular basis. And as a result of working from home, consumers are now, they're spending more time doing the things they like to do, like cooking from home. They're also spending more time with their family and hobbies, and this connections helped ease to a degree the fear and uncertainty associated with the pandemic. Employers, however, are not completely sold on working at home as they believe productivity is down. So what's going to happen after the pandemic? Well, at SMS Research Advisors, part of what we do is we predict behaviors. And based on the information that we were able to gather, here's what we believe is going to happen with predicted behaviors. First off, we think cooking from home is actually going to increase. We think that the 30% of the population that's changed the way in which they enjoy their food, that's going to have an impact. Now, it's going to be slight because the number was so high, but we think that number is going to go up to 85%. We think wearing a mask will be at 25%. The reason why we say that is that the folks that we believe will be wearing a mask are those that are chronically ill, plus those that have a fear or a phobia of germs. Those two in combination make up about 25% of the population. The other thing that's key to keep in mind is that the taboo surrounding wearing masks in the US is decreasing. When it first started, wearing a mask was very taboo in the US. That's why it was so low. But now, because masks have become a regular part of our life, we understand the motivation for them. The government is saying it's okay to wear a mask in certain situations. Our friends are wearing masks. We understand the value of it, and they're available everywhere. Again, attitudes, normative beliefs, and control barriers, all being high, indicate that mask wearing will continue. And then finally, working remotely. We believe that 30% of the population will be working remotely. That's mean where they spend the majority of their time at home. We actually think this number could be higher as the years go on, but at least for the first year, we expect that to be at about 30%. So employers that are really struggling with trying to understand the productivity of working at home are something that they're going to have to really take a long, hard look at. So here's one of the questions that we have for the poll. Which of the following do you think will permanently change as a result of the pandemic? Indoor shopping, restaurant dining, in-person meeting, or routine doctor visits? We'd like to ask you to answer now. You can choose all of those. You can choose one of those if you wish, and then submit your answers, please.
I'll give you just a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end that poll and share those results with you. There you are.
Okay.
Interesting.
Right. I agree. I think that in-person meetings are going to have by far the biggest impact on our day-to-day lives in terms of working in business. So now we want to talk about supply chain insights, what we've really understood and learned. So at SMS, when we began to think about the impact of COVID, we started asking ourselves some questions that we thought we could be able to answer. And there were really 4 that we came down to. In what specific ways is supply chain being impacted by COVID? What changes are happening in organizations resulting from COVID? How do supply chain managers thrive in this environment? And then finally, what are the new expectations for supply chain from buyers in a post-COVID environment? So being the wonderful researchers that we are, we thought we'd get some research to help understand this. And we did 2 pieces of it. We used our Spotlight survey platform. If you'd like more information on what that is and how that is used, please feel free to contact me after the presentation, and I'm happy to discuss it. But what we did is we conducted a series of 10 interviews with folks who are leaders in supply chain. And we did a total of 5 industries: consumer goods, aerospace, healthcare, high tech, and light industrial. And before we go to those interviews, I want to show you the impact of supply chain on an industry. And this happens to be the boating industry. And what you can see is these green bars here represent the amount of units moved all the way from 2016 to 2020. Now, what's interesting is you can see that the year changes, drops dramatically at first, then it spikes and it gets really high in this month. So why can that be? Boats are expensive. Everyone's lost their jobs. How can people be buying boats here? Well, part of the reason why is people are buying boats is because they had more free time. Some people got settlements from their company. They got separation packages. And they said, well, we're going to do something I really want to do for myself. So they bought themselves a boat. But what's interesting here is not only the spike here in boating, which was completely unexpected, by the way, but look at these bars here. These bars are pretty tight in terms of how they drop. You can see they're pretty tight here. They're pretty tight here in terms of the drop. Look at the drop here. This is significant. And what this tells us is that demand was high, but supplies were low. And when we spoke with folks in the boating industry for a client, one of the biggest things we heard is, I don't have the finished goods to complete my boats. As a result, I'm feeling this pinch. And this helped us to understand what folks in other industries were going through. And what we saw is that a boom in demand caught many in supply chain totally off guard. We see the companies are seeing a significant increase in the demand for their finished product, but they can't meet all the demands because supply chain, both in terms of delivery delay and employee absences. So this isn't just an issue of, I can't get the finished goods, but I don't have the people who are able to finish those goods. Discontinued or difficult to find components are seen as an acute challenge. Now, what's really interesting about this is we saw this last year. So prior to COVID, we saw discontinued or difficult to find components being a challenge. Now it's a red hot problem. Another way to look at it is that is a tremendous opportunity for an organization who is looking to branch out into difficult or discontinued product to be able to promote that. Now is the time to do that because now they're feeling it most acutely. We also saw that supply chain is becoming more resourceful in the face of unprecedented demand. So what we see is supply chain managers in response are focusing more of their efforts on the disruption of typical routines and operations. So instead of saying, we don't know what to do, what they're doing is they're saying, well, the traditional process doesn't really work anymore. So now we're looking at different ways in which to fulfill some of the elements of supply chain. This includes self-service and virtual tools. And this was really interesting to us because we wanted to understand what they meant by virtual tools. What they meant was if you had a product that I was going to see, I wanted you to be able to show it to me first. I wanted to see a spec, but I can't get that spec because you don't have the people to build it, but you've got all the designs. Why can't I see it in virtual reality? That's something that is becoming more prevalent that we've seen. It's really started before COVID, but it's really taking off now during COVID. So a question we have for the group is, how has your company been impacted by COVID? Have you seen supply chain disruptions? Have you seen employee transitions from work to home? How about the introduction of safety protocols at work or employee shortages due to COVID illnesses?
I'll give you just a few more seconds for that poll, folks. We're almost there. Okay, I think we're there. I'm going to share those results. If you don't have your answers in, please submit now. Okay. There you have it.
Employee transitions to working from home. Yeah, honestly, in the work that we've done, that's one of the largest we've heard. We heard a story of a health system that was so caught off guard by the employees working from home, they didn't have VPN set up. They didn't have a VPN provider because working from home for them was unheard of. So they had to scramble to get that set up. And from my understanding, the system still isn't perfect. It's been 9 months, it still isn't perfect, but it's there. So the idea that employees transition from home, I think, has been acute for a lot of people. So in addition to talking with supply chain, what we also did is we conducted a survey with consumers in the US, again, using our Spotlight survey online platform. So we talked with over 1,000 consumers, and we wanted to speak with the person who was the decision maker for buying products in their household. And while we spoke to both genders, all ethnicities, and all age groups, here's who we tended to find. We tended to speak with females. They tended to be wealthier, 60% made over $100,000 for their household. They tended to be younger minority folks, so 30% of the folks that we spoke with were minority, were under the age of 35. We tended to speak with folks who were in suburban and the suburbs, and then the vast majority of people we spoke with were employed full-time. So before we get to their insights, I wanted to show you this because we often think of COVID as a time of scarcity, but to understand the impact of it, what I wanted to do was compare the top household items that were scarce during World War II and then during COVID. And you can see that there are several similarities. Medicines were both rare. Meat was both rare. Toilet paper, canned goods, and t-shirts and socks were all rare during World War II and COVID. Now, what's interesting is the canned foods were unavailable for different reasons. In World War II, of course, the metal and aluminum was being used in the war effort, but during COVID, it's because of a supply chain issue that canned foods aren't available. So we often look at the shortages of sodas in stores, specifically Diet Coke. And when we start thinking about why that is, it must be production facility, they must not have enough syrup, whatever it is. No, it's aluminum cans. And the reason why aluminum cans are so short now is because millennials, for reasons we still haven't quite figured out yet, love drinking beer from aluminum cans. And when COVID hit, they no longer drank from bottles. They stopped going to bars because they had to. They started drinking from aluminum cans, and that's helped cause the shortage. So when we look at consumers and how they reacted to COVID, what we saw is a 3-stage process. React with panic, readjust priorities, and then use new motivations to build preferences. The first one is panic. Overall, the vast majority of consumers underestimated the demand for several products. As such, consumers needed to access these products, not because they needed the items immediately, but because there was this sense, this reaction to scarcity. And when we have perceptions of scarcity, we react by buying, and we overbuy. Now, some of this information was actually accurate, but a lot of it wasn't. A lot of it was rumor. A lot of it was anecdotal. Hey, I went to the store today and they didn't have any toilet paper. Therefore, there's a shortage in the US, we should get some. That led to a fear of being left out, which triggers panic buying. As I said earlier, we see the same thing during a hurricane, but this one obviously is much more vast and covered many more items. So when we talk to consumers, here's what we heard. 74% of all consumers admitted they purchased more household items than they believed they needed for their household. We also saw that less than 10% of consumers could accurately recall the brands that they considered being scarce. Now think about that for a sec. I went out and I bought all this stuff, but I couldn't tell you what the brands were. I couldn't tell you what brands were missing. Even though these are brands they regularly buy, the reason for that is that they're overwhelmed by fear. And this fear is driving their inability to be able to have a more positive shopping experience where they interact with the brands in a positive way. Panic buying is never a positive experience. It's always negative, and therefore brand recall becomes very challenging. The other thing that we saw too is that when brands first came to us and asked what we should do or what they should do in the initial reaction to the pandemic, what we said not to do was to pull your advertisement. What we need you to do is retool it. So don't cut off your dollars because that's what you want to do because it's a pandemic and you're nervous. You need to retool your advertising, retool your messaging to be more about we're in this together. And the brands that were really successful during the initial stages of the pandemic did that. The ones that didn't were seen as tone deaf. The ones that didn't were seen as insensitive. So there was a great sense of changing the message midstream. About 3 months ago, we had a company come to us and say, okay, looks like the pandemic's over. Can we go back? And we said, not yet. Number one, the pandemic isn't over. Number two, if the pandemic was even coming to an end, you still need to have the message of solidarity, of we're with you on this, because people are still struggling. And finally, we saw over 3/5 recall seeing a news story about a product being in short supply. So all these three together created this idea of panic. Once consumers began to understand what was actually happening, so what we call personal shortage. And personal shortage means what I lack. It's not what might be out there, but it's what I lack. Once they began to understand what they lacked was actually minimal, they had enough toilet paper, they had enough deodorant, they had enough shampoo. That's when consumers began to change the way they purchased. And they did this in order to fill a new reality. Remember earlier we talked about 30% of the population changed the way in which they cooked food because of the pandemic? Well, we see the same thing here. We saw that 70% of consumers changed some aspect of their purchasing. They changed a brand, they changed a product category or type since COVID began. Now, what's interesting about this is for that 70% of consumers that changed, when are they going to change back? After COVID? No. Once they've changed, they need a reason to change back. And because COVID's ended, the pandemic ended, is not the reason to change back. We're telling many brands now they need to reinvest in how they value their brand, how they're presenting that value proposition in the market. So that unique value proposition becomes part of the conversation for reintroducing their brand, because there are brands that have taken a hit because of a perceived lack of availability or because consumers' habits are changing. And then we saw 38% of consumers have participated in an activity that they've never participated in before due to COVID. Remember this idea we talked about earlier of the safe adventure? Well, that's what we're seeing now with consumers. Consumers are doing things that they haven't done before. They're buying boats, they're getting RVs, they're taking staycations, they're learning new languages, they're building vegetable gardens. There was a run on seeds this spring, specifically tomato and zucchini. And that's because people were planting gardens that they didn't have time to plant before. And then finally, step 3 is building preference. So what we're seeing is consumers are not coming back in a sense of saying that the pandemic is over. The economic collapse has caused some serious harm to buyers, and it's going to take a while for them to come back. And when they do, they have the expectation that they'll be able to purchase the same level of products prior to the pandemic. And that's important to understand, because what we're really talking about here is a group of people that prior to the pandemic were buying certain brands or buying certain products. They were giving themselves the sense that the buying experience was positive. Well, then we have the pandemic, which we know creates a negative buying experience. They readjust their priorities to bring that positive experience back to it. But they also understand too that they want to get back to where they were. They want to go back to buying when there was a positive experience where they were to buy the things they wanted, the things they got used to. Now, because of the scarcity element of it, especially the perceived scarcity, There's some brands that are going to lose loyalty because of this. And they need to be able to come back and come back strong with reminding people why they bought in the first place. For an incumbent brand, that's challenging to do. We've completed a study recently in a electronic space where there is one dominant brand. That brand, I believe, has 67% of the market share. This brand is suffering significantly to a large degree because they're unable to create a new value proposition. They're suffering from what we call the circuit. The circuit is, I buy you because I know you. Well, I know you because I buy you. Well, I buy you because I know you. So it creates this circuit, and dominant brands in the marketplace fall into this trap. When they fall into this trap, they have a real hard time saying, oh, what's our value again? You're buying us because we're the biggest. But when someone comes in and changes the marketplace value, everything changes. Just ask Nokia and BlackBerry what they're doing. It was really challenging for them to be able to compete with Apple in the app. And that's what did it, because people bought BlackBerry because they knew BlackBerry. They bought BlackBerry because they knew it. They knew it because they bought it. It created the circuit. Nokia was the same way. It created a circuit. And when someone comes in and redesigns or reshapes the value proposition like Apple did, then they become dominant, and other companies suffer. So that's something to think about as we move forward in organizations. How do you impact that? So here's what we saw from consumers regarding building preference. We saw that 65% of consumers agree that it's going to take more than a year for the economy to come back once the pandemic ends. So the good news is companies have time. You have time. However, once your time ends, it ends. 55% of consumers expect their buying habits to change back to what they were before the pandemic. Now remember, 70% changed brands, 70% changed products, 55 are going to change back. That's great. There's still a 20% that you got to earn. So it's this idea that once they come back, they want to come back big. So companies that think they're going to take longer than 12 months to get their supply chain back in order are going to really be challenged. We also see that 61% of consumers expect to pay more in the future for products that they typically buy. So what's really an interesting byproduct of this is consumers understand that the pandemic has hurt companies and that they'll need to charge more in order to get more profit, that profit that they enjoyed before the pandemic. Consumers expect that. Consumers are willing to pay more. It doesn't mean you jack the price up for the sake of jacking the price up, but what it means is there's an opportunity, especially among consumers, that they may pay more for those products. So what does this all mean for supply chain in the future? Well, the first thing we see is that supply chain needs to change its focus from inside out to outside in. And here's what we mean by that. Flexibility in the supply chain is really so much more than just adhering to the here and now systems like lean or like agile. What it's about is changing these systems to accommodate seeing the unseen and to prepare for a reaction to the unpredictable. Remember earlier when I talked about how intent is really the supply chain? Well, this is the output of it. We see if supply chain is all about intent, they have to stop focusing on here and now. And systems like lean and agile, as wonderful as they are great in helping understanding what's happening today. They're not as flexible today in being able to predict the future. Supply chain needs to be able to predict the future because they're all about intent. Something else that they need to do is customers or prospects aren't just the domain of sales and marketing. Supply chain needs to start listening to those constituents with an unfiltered lens. Here's what we mean by that. Supply chain often gets feedback from sales folks, from company reps, from manufacturing reps, from their suppliers. Well, each one of those actors has a specific agenda. They have a specific understanding of what they want to say. That creates a bias. That bias is naturally imparted in the message that they give the supply chain. We often hear from sales folks when we first conduct interviews with organizations that, if we just lower the price of the product, oh my God, we would do so well if we just lower the price of the product. And we say, it's not about the price of the product, it's the value associated with it. Benefits minus costs equal value, not price equals value. The only time price equals value is in a commoditized market. And the last thing any of us want is a commoditized market where price becomes the only factor that plays. But that's exactly where it happens. And if you start discounting your product as a result because you're worried about your price is too high, you're now taking a leading edge in creating a commoditized market. The race to zero, everyone loses. Something else that we're imparting with folks in supply chain is quality is now a variable, not the variable. Quality is not always the priority. Before COVID, there was this idea of good enough. And in several industries, good enough permeated. The idea that in the steel industry, Brazil comes in, offers lower quality steel as compared to what the US standard is for a lower price. The reality is that Chinese steel, that Brazilian steel, it was good enough. And good enough hurts. When we think about the auto industry from the 70s and early 80s, well, a car was no longer a statement of who I was. A car was a place to get me from point A to point B. And well, as long as I have a fuel efficient car, I can do that. I can get from point A to point B because that's really all I care about. That's where Toyota, that's where Honda really fit that niche. If the car wasn't a statement about you, it was a place to get from A to B. Detroit took a little too long to understand that and had a significant impact as a result. COVID accelerates this idea of good enough. What we mean is that it's now acquiring and retaining customers who use good enough. So this idea of superior, that needs more thought. A really good example of this is sitting down with an engineer and asking them to design a pen. You will get from an engineer the greatest pen ever. It will do everything you want it to do, and it will be wonderfully weighed, and it will have great ink, and it will cost $50. Bic, I can buy for pennies. All I want to do is write. That's good enough. That's where COVID is taking us. It's a variable, not the variable. Something else to keep in mind is that making supply chain more solution-focused than process-focused is a needed step. Management is willing to bite the bullet and engage with multiple suppliers for a single raw material or part. That's more true now because of COVID than it ever was in the past. Management was really struggling in supply chain to use multiple suppliers because multiple suppliers meant more complexity. It meant more opportunities for failure. Well, with the shortages that exist today, leadership doesn't have a choice. Supply chain has to go to multiple suppliers. And what's interesting is not all of these suppliers are tier 1 suppliers. Remember the idea of good enough? Well, it applies to suppliers too. If your product is good enough, I may not be willing to pay the premium that the superior one wants me to. The other thing that's interesting too is if a supplier today can help locate an alternate component or solution that produces that quality product, that good enough quality product within the desired turnaround time, they're the ones who will win business post-COVID. So if you're working in supply chain today and a company says, hey, I'm looking for X, and you don't have any X, the company that wins says, you know what, I don't have that, but company B does. I talked with my contact over there and they'll be able to help you out. Really, they're going to be able to help me out. Yeah. Boy, I called and couldn't find anybody. I really appreciate that you did that. Okay. Now, they got the business, but when it comes back around again, they're going to go to that guy? They're going to go to you because you're the one who found it. Keep that in mind. It's a process. It's a solution, not a process. And then finally, supply chain leaders see a future path of innovation with single components that are across various verticals. So it disperses the inherent risk associated with the Pareto principle. And that simply is that 80% of the revenue or 80% of the supplies or 80% of the customers, they are 20% of the customers comprise 80% of the revenue. I'm trying to say. That idea is really true in supply chain. Innovation is going to drive single components across verticals. So I have a single component, I'm going to use it across 10 verticals. Right now, I have 10 products all on a single vertical. Well, when that vertical goes down, like aerospace, like transportation, you're locked. You need to spread that out across verticals. That's something else that we're talking about. And as we saw earlier, time is on the side of supply chain for now. Buyers get it. They understand the length of the pandemic means it's going to be a significant amount of time for recovery, and they're willing to be a part of that. However, supply chain should use this time not only to recover, but to re-engineer how they determine inventories. So this includes making sure that they're well prepared for the next pandemic. And what we're really talking about here is looking at how are we figuring supply now? How are we accounting for it? And is there a different way we need to do that so we can be more proactive instead of reactive? I think the other thing to keep in mind is if anyone thinks this is the only pandemic that we're going to experience in our lifetime, they're sadly mistaken. The only difference between us and China, which has experienced at least 4 of these, is that it never was able to escape the borders and come to the US. Well, as we've seen now, it is. And that's an opportunity for supply chain to be able to begin to retool now so that it can become more effective, especially when it deals with inventories. And finally, emphasize finished goods. One of the most often mentioned stories about COVID is the shortage of raw materials. And with the exception of aluminum, we saw that raw material buying didn't impact the US. Only 15% of buyers agreed that a shortage of raw material impacted their finished good production capabilities. So what this tells us is that there's this idea that all of these raw supplies are not there. It's not that the raw materials aren't with distributor A or with distributor A, B, and C. They're just not with distributor A. You got to go to B, you got to go to C. It's the idea of spreading it out, going to multiple sources for raw material that is going to make successful supply chain. It's the organization that focuses on just that one distributor that creates the issue. Inventories for finished goods are absolutely depleted. Absolutely depleted for finished goods. The more luxurious the finished good, the more depleted the raw materials associated to build that finished good are. Supply chain needs to secure multiple sources for raw material. It was a trend that was starting a couple of years ago, but we've really accelerated it now with our clients looking at that, saying that you just need to build a program that allows you to do that. So in conclusion, COVID's impacted the economy in a completely novel way. This was a way none of us expected. The ways in which we expected it to occur are the ones that have always been the case. It's always been about speculators. It's been about greed. It's been about money mismanagement. It's been about bubbles. And that becomes so routine for us that we expect it to happen. This is different. This isn't a bubble. This wasn't speculators. This was a disease, and it's a disease that's ravaged the world. And we needed to be able to understand that difference. So we can't fix it with new accounting principles. We can't affix it with new regulations to support markets. We have to take this in a completely different way. Supply chain managers are developing those new ways, not only to understand the market, but to help them deal with how the market is reacting to their lack of finished goods. And then finally, this future of supply chain is driven more and more by buyer needs. Supply chain needs to begin to understand that they're not there to fulfill a process. They're there to solve a problem. That's just something outside of the supply chain that seems pretty basic. We're all talking about problem solution and things like that. But in supply chain, it's not about the process. It's about solving a problem. And then finally, we have one more poll. Would you like more information on today's topic? You can either answer yes or no.
And Dan, while we're doing that, we had just one question come in, and then I've got a couple other ones if we've got a few more minutes.
Sure.
So the question was, will our businesses return back to the old normal? If not, what does your research say will be permanent changes to the way we work and businesses run? You know, I think you've covered quite a bit of that, but do you have any final thoughts on that?
I do. For companies that are, first off, it's a great question. And for companies that are resisting the change to remote working, we strongly advise you to embrace it. We have clients who have said during the pandemic that they've gone in, some every day, some several days a week, leadership has. And they don't expect their employees to go in, but you know, once this is all over, we're going to get back to normal. When it comes to remote working, you're just not. There's too many benefits for your employees from working at home to be able to say, I'm all of a sudden going to come into work. Even when the children go back to school, even when you can go back in the office again, people are going to say, I want to stay home. And there's two people driving that, two groups of people. One are the frontline workers who are enjoying staying at home, who are doing hobbies and things like that. The other is senior leadership. Senior leadership spends, on average, 45 minutes to commute to and from work each way. 45 minutes there, 45 minutes back. Some spend up to 2.5 hours each way. By working at home, you have now all that time to yourself. And you've realized how more productive you can be as a manager, as a leader, because you're able to think about things. You're able to spend that quiet time, not having to fight traffic, not having to find the subway, not having to get on the bus. That's important. And it's senior leadership that is saying now, well, wait a minute, I liked being at home. Mm-hmm. And I think I want to stay at home for a while. I'm not really interested in going back. So that's something that we're really seeing. That's absolutely the big one.
Yeah, that's great. One more question here. It's about 5 minutes to 4. So you talked about this 3 stages of consumer reactions. Did the consumers revisit all 3 stages of consumer reactions with each new wave in the pandemic?
No, what happened is when we had the initial panic, we were able to chart that the panic began actually in February, and it began in places that typically see panic buying. Florida, East Coast, because of hurricanes. They, to a degree, knew what was coming. So they started panic buying. That created regional stories about panic buying. National news picks up on those regional stories and says, hey, there's panic buying in Florida, and it's toilet paper of all things. Well, in Florida, they understand completely why they're doing it, but everywhere else they don't. So then they start engaging in it. Once that story began to subside, and unfortunately get replaced by the civil unrest that we were experiencing in Minneapolis, once that story began to subside and get replaced, panic buying eased. Now, if you go to your store today, still short of toilet paper, darn if you can find those Clorox wipes anywhere. But that's part of the reality now. That's part of adjusting the behavior. So now I can't use that wipe anymore. I'm now going to use this. I'm not worried about the rumor that there isn't going to be any beef because I go to my store and it's packed full of beef. so I'm not going to worry about that anymore. So they start to adjust. Once they get into the getting back to buying, getting back to elements of their prior buyer behavior, the change has occurred. The motivation has changed. Some will change back, but most will start to find a happy medium. Right now, we went from 1% mask wearing to 96% mask wearing. We're not going to go back down to 1%, but there's no way we're going to be at 96%. 25% is where we're going to be, because the people who are wearing masks are going to have an intrinsic motivation to do so. It's an inside motivation to wear the mask. So that's what we see.
Right. Thank you. We've got a couple more questions. They're very good. So one is, what's your sense on how work from home will impact employment patterns in large cities where cost of living is high?
So when we look at a city like Los Angeles, in research that we've done, we've seen that closer to 35% of businesses said that they were going to vacate for areas outside of the greater Los Angeles area in the next year. Places that would typically be seen as hot properties, Westwood, Brentwood, Santa Monica, are becoming ghost towns for businesses. That has an impact on the sushi places and the bars and restaurants that are associated with that. I mean, there's a ripple effect when a business leaves town. What we see is these companies being able to say, if I'm in Minneapolis and you want to work from Austin, Texas, that's okay, because you can still communicate with us and you can still contribute to our organization in that way. You don't have to be here. I think what we're going to do is we're going to hire people who are outside of our initial frame of thought. So, okay, we're looking for a job for an office manager. Well, that office manager is going to be remote. So, well, we don't necessarily have to hire somebody from Minneapolis to do that. So can we hire somebody from New York to do that? Maybe there's somebody who's already managing an office now and they can manage ours as well. Maybe that could be the case. So it's this idea of all the things we've talked about before: desk sharing, job sharing, remote hours. All of that is now on the table for remote working. So I think it's going to have a pretty significant change in the type of people that are available. It's going to open up the pool dramatically, I think.
Right. Well, here's our final question, and it might take us over just a minute, but I think it's a really interesting question. Is, do you have any comments or thoughts on the vaccine supply chain?
Yeah, I think that the vaccine supply chain has done a tremendous job in being able to react as quickly as they did. In the information that I've seen, we saw that Pfizer reacted in such a positive way so quickly that it allowed them to produce something from literally nothing in a matter of a couple of months. They've had this drug for close to 6 months. It just took all that time to get the regulatories done. Now in the UK, it was a different story. The drug that's available to them wasn't as heavily regulated. As Fauci said, they cut a lot of corners, and it makes only 70% effective. But because the vaccine is going to the US first, the UK felt they needed to have a vaccine as well. I mean, it makes sense, but it's this idea of economic nationalism that drives that, and the sacrifice of 70% effective comes into play. But I think that supply chain, those companies that were able to develop a drug quickly, and it was really only going to be done by the big companies that could be flexible enough to be able to change, to go to multiple suppliers, and to be able to build a vaccine that was going to be more focused on getting out quickly and being effective, as compared to being effective or getting out quickly, as we saw in the UK.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dan. We do have one more question. I'm not going to ask it because we need to move on to our next event, but perhaps I'll have you answer that separately, and then I can get that back out to Joel, who asked that. So again, everybody, we hope to see you at the event immediately following this. So be slipping your ugly sweaters on now in this little interim time. Dan, thank you for your time. I know you're going to plan on hopping to that event as well.
Yep,
so,
I'm going to try to jump on as best I can in the next few, but I really appreciate everyone's time today. I hope this was informative and hope spark some good thoughts with everyone.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone. That's the end of today's presentation. So CPE credits will be available again in 7 to 10 business days, we hope. This does end the webcast, and on to the happy hour and trivial ugly sweater contest. Have a great evening. I wish you the best of the holiday season. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.